In order to talk about symbolism, the third section of our chapter here, I want to actually go back to something from the beginning, a quote that you might have missed as you were reading, might have skimmed over, that modernity is the ephemeral, the fugitive, the contingent, the half of art whose other half is the eternal and the immutable. A lot of big words in there from Charles Baudelaire, French poet. What these all have in common is these words, ephemeral, fugitive, contingent, eternal, immutable. They have a sense of time as well as existence. If something is ephemeral, it is intangible, right? You can't necessarily touch it. If something is contingent, it is temporary or fleeting. So in the same way that the Impressionists sought to capture fleeting moments of light playing on water, for instance, symbolists also embraced modernity by using the mind, the unconscious, dreams, inspired by the psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, of right around their time, around the turn of the century, 1900. The interesting thing about symbolists is they are not necessarily artists who reject traditions from the neoclassical, which might automatically pop up into your head as you look at Puvis de Chavannes' Sacred Grove. This is a feeling among artists of the end of the 19th century, the change from 1800 to 1900 in Western Europe, of needing an anchor for their exploration of these ephemeral, fugitive things. And that anchor is often past style, like neoclassicism and the Renaissance. What people are experiencing during this time is kind of very personal, but the isms that I have here are not art styles, but rather states of being in society. Hedonism, you might not be too familiar with. Pessimism and escapism, hopefully maybe you've heard before. Among the people of France and Germany and Austria and even America around 1900, there was a sense of, among some people, this optimistic excess. To be a hedonist is to shamelessly indulge in the pleasures of the world. So we could see perhaps in this Sacred Grove a little bit of hedonism. What we don't see is pessimism, that the future is automatically going to be terrible, right? It's the opposite, really, of hedonism. And it brings on the need for art as escapism, to get away from reality. And the influence of psychoanalysis and psychiatry, coupled with the reality recorded by photographers, lent kind of a freedom to artists like these symbolists, not only to explore things that were maybe not quite so realistic, but also completely ingrained in these feelings people were having approaching the year 1900, where there was a sense of approaching disaster, depending on where you were in the world. There was a lot of wealth inequality on both sides of the Atlantic, where we call it the Gilded Age in the United States, the age of the robber barons, the Rockefellers, and the J.P. Morgans and the Carnegies. As construction and steel expands, this is the beginning of Cleveland's heyday in that Gilded Age. And yet for many, it was not so gilded, not so golden. And that's where we get this kind of disconnect between reality and the art you see, because this art is very much an art of, at the same time, the upper classes that could afford to buy it and paid attention to it, and the more diverse experiences of the artists themselves. Let's get, there she is. So these themes that are fantasy, dreamlike, they still rely on very classical things like Greek mythology. So I have Odilon Redon's Cyclops that I really wanted to include on your slide list, but I didn't want to give you too much to work with, compared to Raphael's Galatea from the High Renaissance, essentially approaching the exact same story of Galatea chased by the Cyclops Polyphemus from two different angles. One where Galatea is the hero on the left, and the other where we see an almost sympathetic view toward Polyphemus, where he's very childlike, almost very innocent in his monstrosity as he gazes upon the unaware Galatea, who has not yet started running from her pursuer. They are not necessarily coming up with new things, Redon and Puvis de Chavannes, but using the sensibility of the day in a very modern way to rethink these ancient myths, to rethink long-standing traditions of what art could be. So some of these words, dreamlike, mysterious, exotic, nightmarish, that should remind you of Romanticism, because there is a connection to the past in symbolism that is very, very romantic with a big R. It should call in, to mind a lot from that previous chapter. The important thing to remember, though, in the form symbolists take, it's not a unified style. Rather like post-impressionism, each artist gives his own personal definition and angle and sense of what is worthy of being recorded. In this case, Redon's reimagining of a Greek myth with very expressive color and, as you can probably see, very choppy brushwork. What they all have in common, though, is a rejection of illusionism. While there is a connection in terms of subject between Redon and Raphael, the French artist, the symbolist, is definitely not as interested in recording the natural world and the natural body as the High Renaissance master was in the Cinquecento. But in order to get into our slide list examples of symbolism and the rest of the chapter, we go to an artist, Henri Rousseau, who is not classically trained. He is a great example of a naive artist, one who kind of happens upon it from appreciating the artwork of others, not necessarily coming out of the academy. So symbolism is perfect for him in that he isn't trained, schooled in the traditions of the neoclassical or the realist or the romantic. So we have not just a focus on the sleeping gypsy and that unconscious mind, that unconscious state of vulnerability that Rousseau puts together in a very kind of surrealist, dreamlike way, but Rousseau's own position as kind of a self-taught, self-made painter lends to approaching this very differently, because if we were to hold this up to other depictions of the human body, to other depictions of landscape, definitely there are elements here that don't quite hold up to a realistic recording, right? A naturalistic illusion of three-dimensional space on a canvas in this case. where the figure doesn't even appear that they are necessarily lying on the ground. They're tipped up for us to see, as are the lute, which is an age-old symbol, if you remember the Renaissance, and the lion himself here, that is in many ways kind of an aspect of danger, an aspect of threat to the sleeping figure. All of these we might question, well, he needs to work on his shading, perhaps. He needs to work on foreshortening and placing the figure more realistically on the ground. And with Rousseau, that's not the point. The point is the relationship between each of these elements, these symbols that make up the total meaning of the work. And you might be frustrated by the book not giving you a set meaning. It's not quite as cut and dry as many Renaissance iconographic readings can be. So take a look again. We have all these enticing elements, the lute especially. We're looking at, what is this a symbol of? Is this a personification of an artist or art itself, of inspiration that we've seen from many different artists, from the Renaissance, like Albrecht Dürer, as well as even Francisco Goya among the Romantics. But for this one in particular, Henry Fuseli's Nightmare comes to mind, because we have a lute, for instance, that should be maybe acting as a symbol, that's kind of disconnected from the lion. The lion is really the thing that we're drawn to, with a kind of threatening eye and the head right up against the head of our sleeping figure here. So all of these kind of threads we can pull at and try to figure out a singular meaning can lead us really to more questions rather than answers. The way a dream in deep sleep is not always sensible, right? It's not always a sensible plot of a story that our dreams follow. There's something irrational about it, something really absurd about not only somebody asleep that close to a lion who could potentially hurt them, the way we have the woman set upon by the demon in the Romantic work, but also, what are they doing out there, sleeping in what looks like the desert? Also, there's even more ambiguity than that. We have the title Sleeping Gypsy, but man or woman, right? We have maybe the sense of long hair here, but note how texturally that long hair is the same as the clothing, the same as the hills in the background in terms of texture, in terms of working with the paint. Almost as if, again, we could read the figure not necessarily as a gypsy or a member of the Roma community that is always on the move, nomadic, emphasized by the walking stick, not necessarily a figure of the French colonies as a person of color here, but perhaps a more metaphorical, allegorical personification of this more simplified idea of humanity, of people themselves living in the world. And in a way, with all the technology surrounding us in the turn of the century, still as vulnerable as the woman 150 years before, still vulnerable as Galatea thousands of years before. The sense that in this case, art is not necessarily meant to expose something beautiful, but something uneasy, something uncanny, something that we would only really approach in our dreams, our nightmares, rather than in rational thought, looking at the world around us. This need to depict I believe what the book calls psychic life, or the inner monologue of the artist, the mind rather than what they see. That's really where symbolists differ from the Impressionists. Remember, Impressionists are very almost scientifically recording the effects of light and movement around them. In this case, those sweeping lines here that might look a little impressionist rather are made to give us a feeling rather than a sense of the physical laws of the natural world. And that's emphasized by the color choices. Where we should have blue sky, we have bold red and yellow and orange. And down in the water area, even the pier, the bridge, where we expect some sort of solidity, some sort of foundation and landscape behind. Monk here allows the paint to seep into the cardboard. He allows it to be as thin or thick as it comes. So we're drawn focus-wise up to that brilliant bright red that is in many ways a threat, like the demon, like the lion. So with the title The Scream, though, can you hear this painting? Well, like, what sound do you suppose that universal scream Munch writes about very poignantly when he talks about this moment of anxiety and a mental break? What does that scream sound like? Because the important part here is the figure in the foreground is not creating the sound. The figure in the foreground is reacting to the sound. So that is not a screamer in the front, that is someone hearing the scream. So we have a sense of powerlessness from both the visual and the written account of the artist here. So when we approach it that way, that this is not just an illustration of somebody screaming, that lends it more toward the abstract, more towards the symbolist need to focus on the mind, the intangible, not the reality of the world around him. Because in that moment, Edvard Munch was not experiencing reality. He was experiencing something deeply psychic, as the book says. I think maybe that word's a bit loaded. Something a bit more psychiatric, relating to mental illness and mental anguish. One more thing to think about is the relationship of the figures, because there are two in the back. If you follow the diagonal of the wooden railing, then you have to ask, well, are these people approaching? Are they walking away? Is there any relationship between these two? Or is it this kind of singular moment where we're looking at this almost inhuman, skeletal-like figure that we could interpret as Munch himself? We could interpret as, again, a sense of every human, every person experiencing this type of anguish. Is it caused by the people? What is there a cause, a threat, other than that big red sky? Is there a lion? Is there a monster? Is there something here that we can attribute that gaping mouth to, the hands covering up the ears? Where is that scream coming from? When the answer really is, it's coming from everywhere. He calls it this scream of the universe, this cosmic thing that he's experiencing. So we get this opening into the inner mind of the artist in a way that is both very romantic with a big R and a little post-impressionist if we think of Van Gogh. So on the left here, remember, we have this anxiety depicted through the jarring combination of green and red and the gold and yellow throughout. the kind of ghostly figure that is staring at us, or perhaps that we are staring at, the lights themselves, and the radiating energy of the room almost attacking us with that color combination, as if Van Gogh and Munch were experiencing the exact same thing, almost this similar anguish, and yet painting it in very different ways, where you could see Munch kind of paring it down to one or two elements in a painting, so that we might read it a little more personally, a little more universally, even without the writing that both of these artists have left us. So again, thinking of romantic with the big R, think of The Wanderer Above the Sea of Mist, where we have, the lone figure in the foreground versus the landscape in the background. A sense of powerlessness, a sense of insignificance compared to the vastness of nature. Or even in terms of a realist like Winslow Homer, getting a little poetic with, the veteran in the new field, where there could be the element also of what was going on in the world at the time. The end of the Civil War on the left, and that combination of hedonism and pessimism on the right-hand side, even in Munch's native Norway. So we have Europe, including Northern Europe, where people are experiencing, depending upon their class, depending upon their financial situation, depending upon their vocation, their job, either the lightheartedness of the Gilded Age, if they are one of the powerful ruling classes, or that sense of inevitability. Another way to describe the turn of the century is fin de siècle, French for end of the century. And this more specifically refers to artists like Gustav Klimt from Austria, specifically Vienna, where we have an entire moment among Viennese artists like Klimt and Egon Schiele in your book, where that decadence of the hedonistic turn of the century is used to explore the unconscious. It's almost like Klimt and Schiele are looking at the same things, experiencing the same things as Van Gogh and Munch, but they are approaching the problem of fin de siècle in a very different way. Klimt, with all these bright colors and jewel tones and the gold background, can seem rather optimistic, right? But still, we're looking at something that is dreamlike. It's of the unconscious. Klimt in Vienna is directly influenced by Freud, who is working and living in the same city. So the kiss here might seem romantic in tone and as well as subject, but if we look at the flattening patterns of what we could interpret as the clothes and the landscape, that's when we can interpret things that are a bit more in line with fin de siècle. In this case, look at composition, the pose of the people themselves, where instead of two figures kissing, we almost have one single figure that we can see divided up into man on the left and woman on the right. And I can tell you personally, I've always been uncomfortable with the head positions here and relationship of shoulder and neck to hands. This, in this sense, this pose to me is very constricting. It's very uncomfortable. When we have these bright colors, though, the sense of kind of the rectangles on the male side, the circles on the female side, and the flowers in her hair, it all seems like this could be an illustration of a fairy tale, inspired perhaps by religious art of the Renaissance. Yet, for me, that discomfort there keeps me from thinking of it quite that way. And I will say also on the lower right, this drop off here of what we could consider the ground. So if this were the ground line, it would continue. We have this gaping hole as if they're on a cliff, on a precipice about to fall over. That too lends itself toward, if we are thinking in terms of each element is a symbol to be interpreted, it's not as optimistic, not as comfortable a painting as we might interpret. In photography, remember, there are things an artist can do, like a painter, where you could add to, you could change, you can physically manipulate the negative. You could develop the negative onto tissue paper, as Gertrude Käsebier does here, to purposely bring about a feeling of something to interpret, a symbolist interpretation of photography. So in this case, she has essentially had models pose for this photograph, and she's using that soft lack of focus and the title, Blessed Art Thou Among Women, to really cue the viewer to think about a meaning underneath and behind what we actually see on the paper. Blessed art thou among women is part of what the angel Gabriel says to the Virgin Mary when he comes to her in the Annunciation story. So we could automatically think, well, is there a universality to Mary? Is there something that goes beyond just Christian religion? And yes, it's the position of a mother and child here, as we can interpret. We also have mother in a very informal dress, as if she's going to stay home, child very smartly dressed, as if she's about to go off to school, in a doorway. So a doorway we can interpret as a place of change, a transition. This is a mother sending her child out into the world, where again, there's that slightly uncomfortable feeling. There's no way to predict what will happen. What will become of the child? What is the future? That kind of almost inevitability of the future and yet a distrust of the future is what makes this photograph so interesting, because Käsebier is using a technique that comes from inventors, people who were almost fearless in their experimentation, who in the time of Eugène Delacroix here on the left, figured out a way to make permanent these optical tricks of the light in these cameras. So we have very straightforward photography, recording the real world, and symbolist photography, recording the real world too, but in a way that lends towards symbolism, as if the models become actors on the stage, acting out a story for us. You could say that the ultimate fin de siècle, turn of the century art is one that emphasizes transition, that things will change, and that we don't necessarily know how they will change yet. And so that's that ephemeral contingent that Baudelaire was talking about. And Auguste Rodin is definitely on the side of Baudelaire when it comes to his interpretation of sculpture. With his Walking Man from 1905, we can see how he's left some places in the bronze very rough, that give us this lovely play of light and shadow across the body, where we don't even have arms and a head, because the action here, walking, doesn't necessarily require those parts. We have the parts to get the sense of the motion here. So texture and motion are really what Rodin is working with as he casts his bronze statue here. It is really a study of St. John, actually, for a larger work, his Gates of Hell. So this is a very personal piece. This is, at the same time, part of a commission in that grand old patron asks for this to be made process, but also part of a career-long study of the movement of the body. And that's where his distrust of photography comes in, because for him, photography is a lie. It makes something still and makes it permanent when it's not still. It's constantly moving, constantly changing. It's impermanent. So that's why we kind of, well, how do we categorize Rodin's work? Is he an impressionist, capturing that fleeting moment of light playing across the body? Is he a post-impressionist because he is systematically studying the body in his art sculpture in a most very personal way, like a Cézanne or a Van Gogh? Or because this is part of a larger work in which very religious and theological elements come together, is he a symbolist? If we consider him as the most recent in a long line of sculptors, going back to, in this case, Michelangelo on the left, and Bernini's David in the middle here, we can see going from the static, the still, the calm of the High Renaissance to dynamic curve of the Baroque, to not even really identifying. There's nothing that identifies him as John on the right, nothing really that identifies this figure beyond gender, sex, and movement. So we lose any sense of name, story, plot line. It's all just about that moment of left leg, right leg, one foot in front of the other. This tiny motion, almost insignificant in our eyes, in our daily lives, given significance by the sculptor Rodin. He's not disconnected from those works, though, the Davids, because Rodin does get a commission from the city of Calais, much like Michelangelo carving out David in Florence, where we have almost a civic sculpture here. The burghers of Calais, if we go all the way back to the beginning of the course, and the 100 Years' War, the conflict between France and England, these men were ordered to surrender to the King of England with ropes around their necks, prepared to hang and be executed. So the walking man on the right, we can almost see that movement, that structure underneath each of these individual characters as they slowly walk to their doom, essentially. Rodin is also famous for how informal his sculptures can seem. Note how the burghers are not up on this grand pedestal. They are down on our level as if they are, people among the crowd, just like us. And each moment here, not just the legs walking, but especially that expressive hand that appears on the front burgher, and I'd love to detail for you in a plaster maquette, the hand that becomes known as the hand of God in Rodin's work, again, is a career-long study of just these almost insignificant gestures and movements. So you could say, is Rodin just a sculptor, or is he studying human movement, human expression? Because it's not simply a matter of the Rococo sculpture here in terracotta illustrating mythological creatures. He's not just illustrating historical figures from Calais. He is really digging down deep into how would somebody ordered to march to their death look and move and feel. So influenced by the real world, much like an Edmonia Lewis and her Forever Free, but able to get beyond the realism of the previous century, to get beyond the need to simply be illusionist or classical, and to make the art something more of art for art's sake, rather than just an illustration of an event or a person or a place. And that's really, again, reflected in how Rodin's art is displayed. We have the Ecstasy of St. Teresa displayed in this grand marble chapel on the left. The burghers are just out there to be interacted with, to develop that green patina as they're exposed to wind and rain. And of course, related to our own thinker here in Cleveland, his famous thinkers that he made multiple casts of, versus a singular work like Bernini's David here, becomes not only a pop culture icon, but it can become a lightning rod, as our Cleveland thinker was in the 1970s, for a sense of the establishment, as it was here when that thinker was bombed, or simply as it becomes symbolic of the academy itself, the museum itself, art as this discipline that goes beyond just making with your hands, but thinking with your mind, feeling with your entire existence. The idea of art being a part of everyday life, of every moment of the day, is definitely part of Art Nouveau, which we could say is related. It's contemporary to Symbolism, but Art Nouveau kind of picks up the decorative arts and architecture and other designs that aren't really covered by photography, painting, and sculpture of Symbolism. And this is influenced by John Ruskin. If you remember that guy, the one who didn't really like the modern world and an industry very much, definitely praised artists who looked back to the medieval and the Renaissance. This is a way of kind of using the technology of the modern world, of 1895 Brussels, Belgium, in this instance, with the Itveld house, using technology and steel and new materials to create mass-produced art that we can surround ourselves with. So not just a painting on the wall or a sculpture on a pedestal, but the very windows and doors and doorknobs, down to the very details, are designed based on natural motifs, like how kind of tree-like and plant-like, billowing up this stained glass and metal can appear. We have a lot of organic forms as opposed to pure geometry, meant to instill a joy for the maker and the user, a way of kind of bringing back a sense of the handmade, as Ruskin would approve of, to what Art Nouveau translates to new art. What is new about it is at the same time mass-produced in factories, but also designed by particular artists like Victor Horta in this case. Tiffany glass on the right there is definitely born of Art Nouveau. The famous potteries of Ohio, Roseville, Cohen, those are definitely born out of Art Nouveau and that previous century as well, where in some cases, in some houses, you might call it arts and crafts. Definitely on the European side of the Atlantic, this sense of a meeting between the real world and the more dreamy and symbolic world of art is where Art Nouveau and arts and crafts live. Our slide list pick for Art Nouveau then is Antonio Gaudi's Casa Milà. And this is a very personal take on Art Nouveau. Gaudi's style is almost instantly recognizable. If you've been to Barcelona, if you have studied architecture, or if you've even just come across either Casa Milà or Sagrada Familia, the famous church, the Holy Family, that is still not quite complete because Gaudi's designs were just genius, inspired. There didn't even exist equipment and techniques of construction to complete what he had thought of. This is this organic, dynamic form of an apartment building, that's all it is, in stone and iron, molded as if from clay. So to look at it, you have several different views. This view is a little bit different from the books, but from the inside here, you can see, like Horta's staircase, we have very solid materials made to look like something soft, organic, almost living, as if the building itself is a network of caves, or coral reefs, something underwater, something full of vines and trees and flowers. Where in plan, you can see hardly a right angle in the place, hardly a sense of that Neoplatonic focus on the square and the circle of Michelangelo and Leonardo's day in the Cinquecento, not even a sense of fanciful ovals for the sake of elegance that we saw from Baroque architecture. Can we even name these shapes here? Not quite ovals, not quite circles, blobs, amoebas, something that kind of defies geometric name. So that's what we mean when we say organic forms and shapes here, in plan as well as in the decoration of the building. So here's a view from the roof. As you can see, it uses the entire building as something to behold, as a sculpture, as a part of a new experience, living inside it, taking a break on the roof above it, or just enjoying its presence on the street, how it wraps around that corner. Again, thinking of the building as something made by hand, even though realistically it was made in very traditional ways with stone and metal, it appears as if it is handcrafted. The opposite would be something like the Eiffel Tower here. Alexandre Gustave Eiffel is an engineer, and that's really where Gaudi and Eiffel differ. So this is created for a World's Fair, an exhibition of celebrating industry and modernity. Its main function, the tower, is to be a radio antenna. And the French hated it at first, but now it's a symbol of Paris, right? And that is definitely modernity summed up, where something brand new and maybe criticized and hated, the way Monet's work was insulted and cast off, the way the realists were cast out of the salon, out of the academy. Eventually, that avant-garde art, that rebellious design becomes something integral to, in this case, the city of Paris, integral to a sense of a new century, a new time. What's different between Eiffel and Gaudi visually is there's no decoration here. There's complete honesty of structure and purpose. You have an exposed iron skeleton that actually has to be carefully treated to avoid any rusting and corrosion year after year after year. where we hardly get a sense of interior versus exterior. So do we call it a building? Simply just call it a structure, a monument? Because there doesn't seem to be a change of entering the tower. Definitely a change in elevation as you go up the tower, and you get these wonderful views of the Ile de la Cité. But think of from Eiffel's point of view, it's really just meant to receive radio signals. It has become something to climb up and experience as a person might experience a grand building like a skyscraper. Yet, you don't see anyone renting space there. You don't see anyone permanently there. It is at once a thing that can appear very almost ready to be torn down, temporary, as many things associated with World's Fairs and expositions are. And yet, structurally, it can call to mind the flying buttresses of Notre Dame, which is not too far away in the same city of Paris, where we have exposed structure that we think of as kind of very skeletal. Those ribs are essentially holding up the building. And they held up the building even during the Great Fire of a couple springs ago. The longevity here is something that, compared to past expositions like the Crystal Palace in 1851, seems almost miraculous that we haven't taken it apart, that has become part of the fabric of Paris in a way that, I was just reading that there are elements of downtown Cleveland for essentially an exposition year, structures that were built and then torn right back down. And now, the city is rethinking, well, maybe we'll add that again, creating a land bridge between the malls and the lakefront. Thinking about how people experience the city, not just in a special exposition, a World's Fair, a special time or anniversary, but every single day. And that's where I think these two designs, Gaudi's and Eiffel's, meet. Sense of design and art for every day, not just a special day. And nothing says every day like Louis Henry Sullivan's Guarantee or Prudential building in Buffalo. The new material of steel, which is essentially a strengthened form of iron, adding carbon and oxygen. We have a skyscraper now, something that allows us to build further upward and calls for the invention of the elevator. We have, the Brooklyn Bridge spanning the East River, thanks to these new materials and new techniques, that it could just be clad in the same marble that every other building since the Renaissance has been decorated with. Yet Sullivan rejects tradition with his mantra, form follows function. And that essentially means that the way the building appears is an expression of its use. So here we have open workspaces within. So the entire facade is window with just very limited ornament that, if I zoom in, you can maybe just barely see before it gets too pixelated, the terracotta patterns in the exterior and the columns of the lobby entrance below. There's an honesty here, like the Eiffel Tower, to how things are organized within. So we get the same idea of the exterior already has an impression of what the interior is like. And yet this, of course, is a structure to be inhabited and not just used temporarily like the tower in Paris. So with that in mind, from this time of fin de siècle and hedonism and escapism and worry about the times to come, including World War I, in what ways did these modernists break from the past? In what ways did they maintain connections to the past? Earlier styles like the Baroque, High Renaissance, and Romanticism. And of course, how did modernist artists, not just architects, call attention to the facts of art making? No illusion, no trick of the eye, but simple and straightforward paint on canvas, cast bronze, and steel beam and stone cladding. You get what you see what you get, which you might consider, or you might not, the most important breakthrough in the architecture of the 19th century.